The day Vlad the Impaler went too far began like any summer morning on a medieval campaign, at first with dust and the distant rattle of harness, and then with a sight that made men unsteady on their feet. Imagine you are an Ottoman soldier marching under a hot sky toward what should be the ordinary silhouette of a provincial capital. Low walls, a scattering of roofs, the promise of bread and quarters. You see banners, you smell smoke, and smoke is not unusual in war. Then you look closer and realize the trees are wrong. They are not trees at all. They are rows of upright poles, each finished with a human shape hanging like a grotesque fruit. From a distance, it reads as a forest. Up close, it reads as a message. That moment, that physical, impossible cognition that what you are seeing is both deliberate and designed to be seen, is the spine of the story. It is the reason historians still point to one summer in 1462 when a small, embattled principality forced the most powerful army in the region to hesitate, to recoil, to reassess. The Emperor of Conquest did not simply face swords or walls that day. He faced a spectacle constructed precisely to break the mind as much as the supply train. Even the Sultan, Mehmed II, would later say he was stunned. Contemporary chroniclers, perhaps not always dispassionate, record his astonishment in different tones. Sources disagree on language and scale, but not on the point that remains vivid. The sight was engineered to terrify. If this kind of deep, unsettling history speaks to you, consider subscribing. There's more coming that peels back the logic of violence without celebrating it. To understand why such a calculated display existed at all, we must step back to the boy who would become the architect of terror. Vlad III, later known in rumor and pamphlet as Vlad Tepish, the Impaler, was not born monstrous so much as forged, fractured, and instructed by a world in which survival depended on knowing how power is exercised visibly. His father, Vlad II Dracul, accepted the Ottoman suzerainty for Wallachia, and, like many Christian princes of the borderlands, became entangled in tribute and hostage arrangements with the Sublime Porte. In his early teens, Vlad and his younger brother Radu were taken as political pawns to the Ottoman court in Edirne and later in Adrianople. For the years from roughly 11 to 17, the brothers lived not as prisoners in the modern sense, but as wards whose bodies and loyalties were claimed by imperial strategy. Contemporary Byzantine and Western sources describe their upbringing at the court as a mixture of education and coercion. They were taught languages, the rites of court, the military arts, and they watched firsthand how the Ottoman state exercised authority, including its public punishments and spectacles of power. This captivity left more than memories, it left lessons. It taught Vlad the mechanics of imperial dominance, how visibility confers control, how a single dramatic act could ripple into a whole population's behavior. He learned that law enforced by spectacle commands obedience in ways that private cruelty cannot. Some chroniclers, especially later European pamphleteers, turned that education into a caricature, portraying the young prince as corrupted by Eastern despotism. Modern historians urge a subtler reading. The court was a workshop for statecraft, and what a boy learned there, not merely brutality, but the politics of intimidation and demonstration, would later be adapted and radicalized in the narrower, desperate theater of Wallachia. When Vlad returned to his homeland after years in Ottoman hands, he returned to a place where loyalty was fragile, and the nobility, the boyars, had wealth, fortified houses, and shifting allegiances. His family's position was never secure. Civil strife, intrigues, and assassinations stalked the corridors of power. Through a sequence of reversals, betrayals, and a coronation that itself was born of violence, Vlad found himself in a position where the old order had to be remade. The moment of ascension was not merely ceremonial for him. It was a test of whether a ruler could impose authority on a fractious elite. The coronation feast that serves in many accounts as the opening act of Vlad's domestic consolidation was not a sudden fit of bloodlust, but a calculated purge. For weeks and months before and after, he moved to neutralize rivals, confiscating lands, executing conspiring nobles, and making an account of enemies public. Contemporary chronicles and later pamphlets offer varying details, some of them exaggerated in the service of propaganda, but the pattern is clear. To remain prince in a border realm meant proving that disloyalty would be not only futile, but visible and costly. The spectacle of punitive violence thus became an instrument of governance, demonstration as deterrent. The message was as administrative as it was lethal. Power required obedience, and obedience would be ensured by making transgression unthinkable. It is important here to avoid romanticizing or simplifying causes. Trauma is not destiny, and the adoption of terror as policy was a choice made in a specific political ecology, a fragile state, predatory neighbors, and a fractious nobility with the means to invite foreign intervention. Those structural pressures do not excuse brutality, they explain its strategic logic. When we move from motives to methods, the discussion grows clinical. Impalement, as practiced in 15th century Wallachia, is often described in lurid detail by later sources eager for shock value. Modern analysis attempts to strip away rhetorical flourish and reconstruct the technique in restrained terms to understand its intended effects. The procedure involved a wooden stake, typically fashioned from a straight, sizable tree trunk. The stake's length and hardness varied by account and context. Contemporary descriptions imply that it was driven into the ground, and then the body was positioned on it in a way designed to prolong suffering, maximize exposure, and thus maximize the communicative effect. Survival times, according to various chroniclers and modern reconstructions, could range from a few hours to several days. The variability depends on the exact method, the health of the victim, and environmental conditions. Medicalized language helps here. The stake often penetrated soft tissue and organs in a way that led to progressive, rather than immediate, physiological collapse, with infections and dehydration playing decisive roles in a slow death. The clinical detail matters because impalement was not merely about killing, it was about staging an argument. The prince's men often ordered victims to be displayed along roads, near markets, or at approaches likely to be traversed by enemy troops and merchants. Stakes were sometimes arranged in patterns, long avenues to create depth, clustered groves to exaggerate scale, and hierarchical heights to mark status. High-ranking victims might be placed on taller stakes, others were set lower, closer to the ground. On occasion, symbolic elements were added. Turbans or bits of clothing were nailed or affixed to bodies as a deliberate humiliation of identity, an intentional inscription of shame. Those gestures were meant to be read, not as private revenge, but as public grammar. This choreography of terror served multiple audiences simultaneously. For the internal population, it was proof that the ruler could take decisive action against the corrupt and the treacherous, and that rebellion would not go unnoticed. For external actors, envoys, merchants, tributaries, it was a stark signal about the costs of defiance. For invaders, it was psychological warfare in the literal sense, a campaign to cause confusion, delay, and hesitation that could be exploited strategically. An example frequently cited by later chroniclers is that of prominent Ottoman commanders and envoys who allegedly met their end on stakes during Vlad's rule. Hamza Pasha, whose name appears in some accounts as a representative victim, is cited by certain sources. Other accounts question the particulars or the chronology. Here, as throughout, the historian's duty is to indicate uncertainty. Some reports are drawn from regional informants or propaganda pamphlets, their numbers and emphases shaped by the agendas of those who circulated them. Nonetheless, the cumulative documentary picture is sufficient to show that impalement was deployed systematically, not sporadically, and that it was central to Vlad's attempt to reconstitute power in Wallachia. The rhetorical architecture of impalement was matched by corresponding military choices when external threats appeared. Vlad did not attempt to throw his small principality against the Ottoman behemoth in open-field confrontation. He did not possess the cavalry or the manpower to meet Mehmed II's levies head-on. Instead, he leaned into mobility, attrition, and the strategic use of landscape. Scorched earth tactics, the destruction of supplies and fodder, and targeted raids designed to harry, disorient, and demoralize. When the Ottoman ruler decided in 1462 to move into Wallachia, the campaign that followed was not a succession of pitched battles, but a contest of wills, logistics, and psychological dominance. The escalation began with a series of provocations and miscalculations. Vlad had refused, in some accounts insultingly, to continue paying customary tribute. He also engaged in raids across the Danube, attacking Ottoman transports and caravans, seizing supplies, and occasionally taking prisoners. Medieval diplomacy was brittle, and a front could become justification for a punitive expedition. Mehmed, who had conquered Constantinople just 9 years earlier and whose appetite for consolidation was considerable, assembled a considerable force in response. Estimates of the Ottoman army's size vary widely. Some contemporary sources inflate numbers for rhetorical effect. Ottoman chroniclers and later Western pamphleteers alike have incentives to magnify either the threat or the triumph. Modern historians offer more restrained ranges, tens of thousands rather than the hyperbolic hundreds of thousands sometimes claimed. The key point, however one counts them, is the imbalance of scale. Wallachia was outmatched in manpower and material. Faced with this imbalance, Vlad's strategy emphasized attrition and psychological disruption rather than conventional engagement. He ordered villages and granaries burned to deny supplies. He harassed Ottoman foragers with small mobile detachments, and he used ambushes and night operations to instill chronic insecurity. These actions were not merely defensive, they were designed to shape an operational environment in which a large, logistically complex army would be vulnerable. Supply lines are the nervous system of an army. Vlad attacked that system. Among his gambits, the night attack of June 17, 1462, remains one of the most daring and dramatic episodes. Sources differ in details: who led the assault, how close the attackers got to the Sultan, whether the palace was entered, but the broad stroke is consistent. A group of Wallachian fighters infiltrated or mounted an operation against the Ottoman encampment under cover of darkness. Byzantine chronicler Leonicus Chalcondyles, who wrote with a certain distance but also with access to regional information, depicts chaos in the Ottoman lines and a shaken command. Ottoman accounts acknowledge raids and losses in their rear, though their strain is to minimize the Sultan's exposure. Modern historians generally concur that Vlad's forces created temporary disorder within the Ottoman camp, and that Mehmed briefly considered the risk to his person and his supply situation to be grave. What made the night attack significant was not solely the physical damage inflicted, but the psychological aftershock it produced. An invading army that cannot secure its camps, that must fear assassination in its own tents, is an army whose momentum and will are sapped. Reports claim that the Sultan's retinue panicked at times during those nights, that rumors ran like wildfire across the encampment, and that trust in local guides and intelligence frayed. Whether Mehmed himself narrowly escaped death, chroniclers on both sides conflate bravado and terror. The operation was a clear tactical success for a smaller, more mobile force. As the campaign stretched into weeks, Vlad doubled down on strategies that combined attrition with spectacle. He continued to devastate the countryside, destroying fodder, poisoning wells according to some accounts, though the evidence for systematic poisoning is thin and likely overstated. and leaving strips of land useless for immediate requisition. Meanwhile, parties of Wallachian riders struck supply convoys and cut communication lines. Mehmed's army advanced into a landscape increasingly inhospitable to classical siege and foraging techniques. The campaign began to resemble hunting a phantom that kept disappearing into the woodlands. Those assaults set the stage for the day the Ottomans would finally approach the Wallachian capital itself. Months of harassment, burning, and guerrilla pressure had not produced a decisive pitched battle, but they had produced something arguably more dangerous for an invading force: uncertainty. Not knowing whether one will be attacked in camp, on the road, or at night changes the calculus of command. It amplifies rumors. It makes every pause feel risky. By the time the Ottoman columns neared Targovishte, morale and supplies were frayed. Scouts reported signs of previous fires, of scorched fields, of abandoned wagons. Then, on the approach to the city, came the peculiar, calculated thing Vlad had prepared for this exact kind of moment. Not another raid or a barricade, but an entire landscape altered into a text of intimidation. The army halted at a distance, and what unfolded before the soldiers' eyes was both a physical arrangement and a communicative composition. A forest made of men, set out in rows and columns, occupying vantage points along the approaches and on the skyline. Here we encounter the intersection of spectacle and strategy as a single, devastating instrument. The impaled were not merely corpses, they were punctuation marks in a sentence addressed to the invader. The composition read, "Proceed and risk what you will. Withdraw and live. Defy and face what is made visible." The visual grammar was precise: scale to convince, placement to ensure visibility, hierarchy to indicate that status or rank would not protect you. The forest was curated. Contemporary sources struggle with numbers, and for good reason. Eyewitness accounts from Ottoman soldiers and later Western pamphlets use figures that range widely. Some claim as few as several hundred, others as many as tens of thousands. Saxon and German pamphlets circulated for sensational effect in the years after favored larger figures. Wallachian and Hungarian documents, often sympathetic to Vlad's anti-Ottoman stance, sometimes downplayed the spectacle or contextualized it as defensive. Modern historians, reading the biases of each source and cross-referencing logistical plausibility, tend to offer more modest, if still formidable estimates, several thousand to perhaps a couple of tens of thousands on display, depending on whether the number includes those killed in earlier raids, prisoners, and variously reported victims. The precise arithmetic matters less than the experiential fact. The array was large enough, visible enough, and legible enough to have a decisive psychological effect on an army already vulnerable to demoralization. Up to this point, Vlad's campaign reads as a sequence of choices calibrated to exploit asymmetric advantages. He could not outmatch Mehmed by force. He used fear and deprivation to degrade the Ottoman army's cohesion. Yet, even as these tactics worked tactically, striking convoys, disrupting foraging, sowing panic, they also deepened a pattern: the normalization of public theatrical violence as a tool of statecraft. That normalization would prove double-edged. The same instrument that saved Wallachia in the short term would corrode its alliances and moral standing in the longer arc of events. The army's reaction to the sight of the impaled was not uniform. Some men vomited or collapsed into prayer. Others attempted to look away or to insist the display was the work of enemy propagandists, psychological safeguards that armies often use to deny a traumatic perception. Commanders debated what to do next. Scouts went forward to verify the scene. Some sent reports back, their language varying from measured caution to alarmist hyperbole. Mehmed gathered his council.
He had options: to press on, to engage in siege operations, to withdraw and regroup, or to attempt to negotiate. Each option carried risks. Pressing forward risked psychological contagion and potential logistical collapse. Withdrawing risked political embarrassment. Negotiating appearing weak. It is in this moment, when calculation meets cognition, that the day we have been following reaches its moral and historical fulcrum. What looks like mere cruelty is revealed as a tactic that forces choices upon an adversary in a way that battlefield maneuvers cannot.
The forest of the impaled was designed to be an argument made visible. Surrender the claim to easy mobility and tribute, and accept a rule that will answer disobedience with unmistakable clarity. The Sultan's pause, whether described as astonishment, disgust, or strategic reevaluation, was exactly the intended effect. But pause is not permanence. The strategic victory of a moment does not guarantee political durability. Even as Mehmed's forces hesitated, internal consequences were accumulating for Vlad. Allies were unnerved, neighboring powers watched with a mixture of admiration and alarm. Propaganda campaigns began converting horror into legend. The stabilization of rule required more than terror. It required alliances, economic stability, and legitimacy that spectacle alone could not secure. Those longer temporalities, exile, shifting loyalties, and the eventual reversal of fortune remain to be told. For now, the campaign has reached a critical inflection point, an invading army confronted with an engineered tableau of suffering, a ruler who had learned cruelty's grammar in his youth and applied it with administrative rigor, and a set of decisions that would reverberate beyond the battlefield. Too often, the story is reduced to a single image of grotesque excess. The fuller truth is naughty. What we've traced so far is the logic that produced that image, a logic of deterrence, of asymmetric advantage, and of governance by spectacle. What remains is to see how those choices played out in the immediate aftermath, how the Sultan reacted at the level of command, how the Ottoman army adjusted its movements, and how Vlad's own political fortunes shifted as a consequence of wielding terror as a policy instrument. If you want a closer look at the sources behind these claims, the chronicles, the pamphlets, the modern analyses that sift throughout the propaganda and the facts, the description has a short bibliography and notes on where interpretations diverge. In the next segment, we will move from the camp's stunned deliberations to the crucial moments of confrontation and retreat, to the diplomatic exchanges and the immediate strategic costs and gains that followed this day of spectacle. The council in Mehmed's tent did not yield a simple answer. Reports filtered in from scouts, from trembling messengers who had seen the arranged stakes on the skyline and the avenues of bodies that framed the approach to Togovishte. Some commanders counseled pressing on, take the city quickly, burn the seat of resistance, punish the prince who had so brazenly flouted Ottoman authority. Others warned of the erosion of the army's cohesion, supplies stretched thin, horses thinning from lack of fodder, guides and local auxiliaries uneasy after nights of raids. Above all was the problem that practical armies dread more than a single defeat: uncertainty. Could a commander be certain that the next night would not bring an assault inside the camp? Could he be sure his wagons would not be cut apart by invisible riders? Could he guarantee the safety of his new recruits and camp followers, the lifeblood of any medieval host? Mehmed's reaction, in contemporary reports, is filtered through partial witnesses and partisan writers. Ottoman chroniclers, intent on safeguarding royal prestige, stress logistical difficulties and the strategic prudence of temporary withdrawal. Western and Saxon pamphlets, eager for sensation, emphasize his horror and shame at encountering the impaled. Modern historians, reading both sets of sources and the operational constraints of the field, tend to blend these pictures. Mehmed, a seasoned commander not prone to panic, confronted a series of tactical headaches: guerrilla harassment, dwindling supplies, local intelligence failure, and a deliberately engineered moral shock that made the prospect of sustained occupation unpalatable. Imagine for a moment that you are an officer in the Sultan's retinue. You have seen armies routed by skill or numbers. You have read dispatches about sieges and negotiated capitulations. But what do you do when the ground ahead speaks a language of humiliation and threat you have not been prepared to answer? You count your wagons, tally your wounded, assess the heat and the river crossings, and then you listen as the voice you trust weighs odds. The decision to halt and then to withdraw was not simply the tributary of revulsion. It was a choice rooted in arithmetic and risk management. Retreat, when it came, was not a chaotic rout. Mehmed did not order a panicked flight. He staged a withdrawal, re-establishing lines of march, attempting to secure supply trains, and using his superior cavalry to screen movement. Yet the image of the impaled endured in the minds of soldiers. Some marched with faces averted, others muttered prayers. Rumors multiplied, embellished casualty numbers, invented anecdotes of Ottoman notables displayed as a warning, stories that made their way into European pamphlets and court gossip. The propaganda effect was bidirectional. For Vlad, the spectacle had accomplished its immediate purpose. It slowed and complicated the invaders' campaign. For the Ottoman court, it produced embarrassment and appetite for retribution in the longer term. Vlad's momentary tactical success carried political consequences closer to home. The use of public theatrical violence as a governing tool began to calcify into a pattern that alienated potential allies and unnerved local elites. Merchants from Transylvanian Saxon cities who relied on Wallachian markets and safe passage found their caravans at risk. Regional magnates and clerics who might have preferred a strong, independent Wallachia now faced a ruler whose methods could implicate them by association. European courts, hearing lurid tales of stakes and public mutilations, accounts whose accuracy is often difficult to verify, sometimes recoiled. The very moves that had made Vlad's deterrent vivid also narrowed his diplomatic space. In the months and years that followed, the balance between immediate strategic gain and long-term political cost became visible. In the short term, Vlad had preserved his realm from a decisive Ottoman occupation. He had inflicted wounds in the form of lost supplies, disrupted logistics, and bruised morale on one of the age's most formidable armies. Yet his reputation, already the product of rumor and propaganda, hardened into a dual image: protector of Wallachian independence to some, despot and murderer to others. The dissidents at home, the boyars whose interests were threatened, now had a pretext. Neighboring powers, who might otherwise have helped consolidate his position, weighed the risks of aligning with a ruler whose methods bespoke unpredictability. Political fortunes shifted swiftly in the volatile politics of the Carpathian borders. Alliances, arranged marriages, and the patronage of powerful neighbors decided who would sit on Wallachia's unstable throne. In the winter months after 1462, pressure from pro-Ottoman factions and the diplomatic sway of the Sultan began to bear fruit. Vlad found himself isolated. Allies were reluctant to commit resources to his cause. The fine line between terror as deterrent and terror as governance had become a trap. Accounts diverge at this point. Some place Vlad fleeing toward Transylvania and seeking refuge with King Matthias Corvinus of Hungary. Others assert he attempted to secure new alliances in Moldavia. What is clear, despite the uncertainties of exact chronology, is that within a year or two, his hold on power weakened to the point where he lost his throne and went into foreign hands. Here again, the historian must navigate competing narratives. Hungarian sources suggest that Matthias saw in Vlad both a useful instrument and a liability. Useful when confronting Ottoman advances, dangerous because his notoriety could provoke unrest or complicated diplomacy with other Christian princes. Some modern reconstructions indicate that Matthias held Vlad in custody for an extended period, roughly a dozen years by some accounts, not as a convicted criminal, but as a detained noble whose utility could be summoned when geopolitical winds shifted. The length and nature of his detention are debated. Contemporary paperwork is fragmentary, and later narratives often fold in politics and moralizing. What strikes a historian reading these records is how rapidly political calculus can convert a wartime ally into a detained pawn. When Vlad eventually reappeared on the political stage in the 1970s, it was in a different cast. King Matthias, responding to new Ottoman pressures and local dynamics, released Vlad or allowed him to muster forces to reclaim his throne. The return was brief and violent. Accounts from both Ottoman and regional sources agree that Vlad returned with a small contingent, seized power, and then perished not long after. The precise circumstances of his death are part of the same fog of rumor and competing report that has long shrouded his life. Some chronicles insist he fell in battle, others suggest assassination or betrayal. One detail transmitted by multiple Ottoman sources and later repeated in European accounts is that his head was sent to the Sultan and displayed as a proof of death, a grisly diplomatic message consistent with the brutal logic of the era. Modern historians treat this report as plausible and widely attested, while still flagging the difficulty of absolute certainty in medieval forensic claims. Throughout these later events, two threads persisted: the tactical effectiveness Vlad had demonstrated in 1462 and the corrosive effects of normalizing spectacular violence. His methods secured moments of survival and liberty for Wallachia, but at the expense of long-term political alliances and moral credibility among peers. The scene at Târgoviște, the Forest of Impaled, became both a local measure of deterrence and a European touchstone for barbarity. Saxon merchants and German pamphleteers amplified the latter image, turning Vlad into an emblem of terrifying cruelty. In the centuries that followed, literary imagination transformed that historical residue of Vlad's name into Gothic fiction, creating a separate cultural afterlife that often obscures more than it reveals. That duality, strategic efficacy and moral corrosion, is a central lesson of Vlad's career. The use of terror as a political instrument is effective precisely because it imposes a cognitive cost on the adversary: hesitation, disgust, fear. But weaponized fear is an acid as much as it is a tool. It eats away at mutual obligations, at the willingness of neighbors to trust, and at the possibility of constructing durable institutions. In the immediate sense, Vlad had forced one of the era's great conquerors to pause and withdraw. In the expansive sense, his methods contributed to a cycle in which isolated ruthlessness provoked coalitions and diplomatic solutions that ultimately ousted him. We must also insist upon the methodological caution demanded by these sources. Many of the most lurid accounts come from pamphlets and chroniclers with clear rhetorical aims: to scandalize, to warn, to entertain. Saxon and German pamphlets circulated images of Vlad as a figure of grotesque delight that served European appetites for the monstrous other. Ottoman chronicles, for their part, emphasized the insult and the political stakes of having a subordinate prince who had not only refused tribute but had apparently humiliated Ottoman emissaries and commanders. The historian's work is to cross-examine these accounts, to triangulate with logistical plausibility and the broader archival record, and to present range and uncertainty rather than tidy certainties. What does this mean for the central day itself, the day we have followed from its opening moment of cognitive violence? The scene's immediate strategic effect is less in doubt than its numerical details or its precise modalities. Whether the number of impaled was in the low thousands or pushed into the tens of thousands by later propagandists, the spectacle was of sufficient size and placement to alter a campaign's course. The moral calculus, however, is less resolvable. The same action that prevented immediate conquest also hardened the narratives that would isolate Vlad politically. The same tactic that protected a realm arguably cost the prince the alliances necessary to keep that realm stable in the long term. There is, too, a human dimension that deserves name. The people who found themselves on stakes, the families who lost kin, the merchants whose livelihoods were jeopardized, these are not abstractions. Contemporary accounts sometimes render them as instruments of state policy, but they were also human beings whose suffering was instrumentalized for political ends. The historian's duty is to narrate action and consequence without aestheticizing pain, to explain, to contextualize, to make sense rather than to titillate. Finally, consider memory and myth. Over subsequent centuries, Vlad's name became a mutable signifier. In Romanian folk memory, in some nationalist retellings, he was at times a defender of the land against Ottoman encroachment. In German and broader European print culture, he often appeared as a monstrous exemplar of Eastern despotism. In literature and later popular culture, those traces recombined into a fictional vampire that bears little resemblance to the political prince. Each transformation tells us less about the original man and more about the anxieties and obsessions of those retelling him. Our task is to disentangle those layers as carefully as the sources allow. If you try to answer in a sentence whether Vlad should be remembered as a hero or a monster, you find the dichotomy too crude. He was a product of his circumstances, of borderland politics, of imperial pressures, of a youth spent under the shadow of the very empire he would later resist. He was also an agent who chose methods and thereby shaped his fate. The forest of the impaled remains a powerful metaphor for the paradox he embodied, an image of defense that also marks the moral limits of what a polity can do to survive. For viewers who want to dig deeper, the primary chronicles of the period, Ottoman accounts, Laonicus Chalcondylas, and various Central European pamphlets are instructive when read against modern historiography that corrects for propaganda and scales claims to logistical plausibility. In the description below, you'll find a short bibliography and notes on where historians disagree. That reading shows how history, rumor, and myth converge in figures like Vlad, contested, riven, and endlessly interpretable. One last image to close on. Imagine walking the road out of Târgoviște after the Ottoman columns have rearranged themselves and the wagons clatter away. The summer air has the same heat. The smoke still hovers over scarred fields. You look back and see that arranged landscape, the stakes silhouetted against the skyline, a grotesque garden that made a point about obedience and consequence. It worked, in the sense that it froze an invading army's impulse and bought a small polity a season of autonomy. But the cost was also plain. Alliances frayed. Life became less secure in other ways. And the prince who built that garden paid with exile and a violent death whose details are still disputed by chroniclers. History does not offer tidy moral solutions. It offers instead a record of choices and their reverberations. Vlad's was a choice to weaponize fear on a grand, visible scale. That choice yielded both temporary safety and long-term estrangement. It produced an image that would haunt Europe's imagination for centuries and a question that remains unsettling. When terror secures victory, at what point does it begin to unmake the victor? If this account left you wanting more detail on sources or a deeper dive into military logistics of the 1462 campaign, check the description for a curated list of primary chronicles and modern studies. If you found this episode compelling, consider watching our next deep dive on how siegecraft and logistics reshaped late medieval warfare. and subscribe to keep exploring history's difficult and often uncomfortable moments.